We have with us two really brilliant and pioneering local historians, Michelle Stahl, who is Executive Director of the Monadnock Center for History and Culture in Southern New England, and Jennifer Carroll, who is the Director of Education for the Historical Society of Cheshire County, also Southern New England. And together, they have been working on a project for some years with a team of what they call citizen archivists, who've put together a database of nearly 500 people, members of the Black community in Southern New Hampshire, about whom very little, if anything, was known before, which puts casts a new light on what the history of Southern New England, of Southern New Hampshire in particular, but all of New England is, in areas that we previously thought were simply almost entirely white. So I'm really delighted that we can host this workshop. I think it's really exciting. We've had emails from people saying that they're also engaged in this research. So I feel like it's, mushrooms coming up everywhere. If you would like to be in touch about this project and contribute your research and suggestions and so forth, you can contact Jennifer Carroll at the Historical Society of Cheshire County, because there are so many different local historical groups doing it and independent scholars that it's important to join forces. You might have noticed in an email yesterday that there are handouts. So if you haven't had them, I'll send the link again. But don't worry about taking copious notes. And because there's a lot of detail here, and you'll want to have it down in black and white. So the structure of the evening is most of it, about 40 minutes, will be first Michelle and then Jennifer presenting on the methods and research sources and some of the tips and the pitfalls of this sort of work. And then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So along the way, if you have questions, can you put it in the little chat box below? And then I'll field the questions and the presenters will respond. I just want to say one thing about questions. If you have very detailed questions about your ancestors, for instance, it's probably best to follow those up with Jennifer or Michelle at a later date, because they won't be able to answer detailed questions anyway in this presentation, but because they won't have the research with them, the resources, but also because it's not, of general interest. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Michelle and Jenna, and let's welcome them to this exciting workshop.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. A note on the handouts. The idea with that is you would want to have that information for later on. So don't worry, you don't need them to enjoy the presentation. So the Recovering Black History project that Historical Society of Cheshire County and the Monadnock Center for History and Culture has its roots going back to the fall of 2019. And then in 2020, in the pandemic year, because everybody was able to sort of take a step back and you weren't going to the office every day, didn't have the same demands. Jennifer and I were able to really focus on the project and to recruit volunteers. But I'd like to give you kind of an idea of the scope of the project, because I know many of you who are tuning in tonight are not in our neck of the woods. I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the scope of our project and where we're located. So we're in the southwestern corner of New Hampshire, and you see on your left there a map of New Hampshire. That's divided up into the regions of New Hampshire, not the counties. So our area is called the Monadnock region, and it is made up of 38 individual communities. All of them are pretty small towns. Keene, where Historical Society of Cheshire County has its headquarters, is the only city in our region. And it's a very small city of, about 30,000 residents. So we're a really small town rural area. We straddle two counties. So all of Cheshire County is in the Monadnock region. And then the very westernmost towns of Hillsborough County are also in the Monadnock region. our time frame is 1730 to 1930. And the reason that we were so expansive around our time frame is because this kind of research has really never been done before. So we wanted to cover a really broad spectrum of our region's history. And the early date of 1730 might have folks who know history from the Boston area or the Seacoast or Connecticut as sort of late in the game. But for us, this is the very beginning of European settlement in southwestern New Hampshire. Fort Dummer is established on the Connecticut River in 1724. And the Connecticut River is highlighted there in yellow. And then on the other side of our region is the Merrimack River, which began to be settled in the 1720s by Scotch-Irish Presbyterian immigrants. And our settlement pattern actually sort of flows into the center of the region from those two river basins. So you can see that we have a big scope. We have 38 towns, we have 200 years of history, and we knew that the two of us were never going to be able to do this on our own. Because as we all know, we don't have that big book of history sitting in the back room where you just look in the index. Black history in the Monadnock region, page 374. The evidence, the history is in all these different places, different documents, different sets of records located in different places, both locally and nationally. So we were going to need help to find all of this. So we started recruiting volunteers to help us. We called them the citizen archivists. And the idea was that, like an archivist, these folks were going to be combing through the records, trying to put together a diverse set of paperwork into a coherent whole. We knew that we'd have to go both online and in-person archives to make sense of all the traces that are left everywhere. It was easy to recruit volunteers. Many people were willing to help out with this project. So we started with Zoom trainings to get people sort of acclimated to how to do the research, how to go through census records, and how to use our research method and methodology for collecting information, which I'm going to get to. And we also recorded the training. So that made it really easy as we had new volunteers coming on to be able to onboard them very quickly, because we didn't have to schedule a new training. We could just give them the video of the first one. Now, over the last 4 years, since 2020, some of those volunteers, they've fallen by the wayside. This is very painstaking kind of research, and you can spend a lot of time coming up with nothing. So some people they just found it wasn't their cup of tea. Other people, life changes, new grandchild's born, and they don't have as much time. But some people became deeply engaged, and those became like our super researchers. And if you attended the program a couple weeks ago with Gail, she's one of our super researchers. There were some pitfalls, though, that we found, not so much in using volunteers, but for ourselves as the project leaders. Being consistent with our engagement with the volunteers to keep them engaged has been really tough. We both have enjoyed institutional support for this project. Nobody has questioned whether the value of doing it, but we also have really demanding jobs in addition to this. So we haven't always been able to give this as much attention as we had hoped, or consistent attention. And that has been a pitfall. So I bring that up only if you're considering a project using volunteer researchers, really have a plan at the outset for having regular engagement so that you can keep people invested and feeling valued for the time that they're putting in. Now, we've had, at the height of this, or really I should say, over the last 4 years, we've had over 30 volunteers working on the project, and they have ranged from high school student, college students, graduate students, all the way up to retired academics, other retired professional people. So it's been really a gamut of different people from different walks of life helping us do this. But we didn't want to end up with just like piles of notes, right? We needed to be able to collate all this information in a way that made it usable and accessible. And I also forgot to mention, we didn't really have a budget. So we didn't have, we couldn't hire a tech person to set up some kind of fancy database for us. We really had to bootstrap this and figure out how to make it work on our own and not spending any money. So we decided to use Google Forms as a way for people to record their research as they did it. And this is the initial page of the form, and then the second page. The form is very long and complex, so I can't show you the entire thing on one screen. But just to give you an idea of when the volunteer would go in to start entering the information they found, this is what they would be doing, is filling in fields. So the price was right, didn't cost anything. And it gave us, on the other side, this goes into a spreadsheet. So all of the information from all these different volunteers working at different times is all feeding into one centralized place. It also meant that we would be able to go back to the form, we would be able to go back, look at a piece of information about an individual and trace it back to its source, because ultimately you really have to know where things came from. Oops, there we go. And this is a listing of all of the data fields that are encompassed in that form. And you can see how we've broken it out. And we did collect administrative information. It's really important to record who's doing the research, because, sometimes people get off track, and you want to be able to see everything they've worked on so that the two of you can go back and double check things. And also, you had to have a place to put citations, that sort of stuff. And then after that, it was all about the person. So each line of data that we're creating in the spreadsheet represents information about one person from one source. So for some people in our spreadsheet, we have dozens of lines of information that all come from different sources. But because it's a spreadsheet, we can sort it and find all of the information about, say, Baker Moore or one of the other people that we've been researching. We base these fields on the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire has a database called Black New England. And we based it on their database with the hope that ultimately maybe our information can be imported into their larger database. We also added a few extra things like geography, because oftentimes in sources you'll find references or even little hints like live near the old Knight place, or had a house on such and such brook. And those little geography notes can be really helpful when 3 months down the line you find another little thing and you're able to put it together and actually locate where somebody lived. Sometimes you get lucky and there's a map and it shows you right where they lived.
Michelle, can I just add one more thing?
Yes.
When it just reminded me, as you were talking about how we this whole Google form would be for one person. So if we had a census with a family, then it's important to note that, yeah, we'd have to do this form, or the volunteer would have to do the form for every individual in the family, so that we make sure that we've got everyone. So I just thought we should mention that too.
Right. And that's important. So for example, if you have a family with a mother and father and 2 children, you may end up finding information about those children when they're older, when they're adults. And if they don't have an entry for that census form with their own name on it, you could miss that when you're sorting your information and pulling people together, all the information from all the different sources. That I will admit that, because I've filled out that form quite a few times myself, it can be tedious. That is one drawback of this method. is that you're skipping over a lot because not every source is going to have information for every field, and you're having to do it over and over again. But on the plus side, it does give us that, we call it the authority file, that centralized location for all the information. And let me show you. So I don't know how well you can see this on your screen, but this is what we call the authority file. This is what it looks like on the other side. And you can see that we've got the researcher, we've got the town, what kind of record it is, the person's name, if they're living in someone else's household, and so on. The nice thing about this is this part of the system is only accessible to authorized users. So you don't run the risk of somebody inadvertently scrambling the data up, which you would if you just had everybody typing into a spreadsheet.
Mhm.
It records live, so things get added all the time, and you have one place that's the most up to date. We've made it our practice that if we're going to be looking at information, if we're going to be collating information and putting together biographies of people, or for whatever reason, we download this from Google and we work on that on our computers, which then has created an ongoing backup system because we have all those downloads. So if something did happen to the Google sheet, we would not have lost all the information. We would have the most recent download would be our backup. Okay. So we had a way to collect the information, but then we needed to have a process because the information is in all these different places and different types of sources. And we didn't want to leave any stones unturned. So we developed what I think of as kind of an archives archaeology, where we're peeling back layers by source. So think of each source as a layer. And then when we find people, we go deeper. So the initial layers that we asked the citizen archivist to look at was census records. This is US censuses, and town and county histories. And Jennifer is going to go into some really good tips about using those as well as other sources. Once we found someone, we had a name for them, either coming from the census record or from the town or county history. Then we could start going into vital records through ancestry or family search. We could Google them. We could look for them on Find a Grave. You know, there was all these different places that we could go once we had a name. We assigned each of the volunteers a town initially to work on. And I think out of the 38 towns, I think there's only one town where we did not find anyone over the 200-year history. So I'm going to take you through, I want to share with you one of the early people that we found and talk a little bit more about using these layers and how it played out with his story. So this is Juba Savage. This is an 18th century person. We found him in the 1790 census for Temple, New Hampshire. He's living there with 2 other people of color in his household. So then we turn to the published town history of Temple, which was published in 1860. And we did a keyword search. We did it online through archive.org. And we found in some notes on the selectmen in the 18th century that there was this entry that says smallpox in 1792 paid a short visit to the Negroes who dwelt near the old glass house. As witnessed, ye town votes, October 15th, 1792. Then a man be procured to inspect ye houses of the smallpox, both at Mr. Todd's and Juba Savage's. The selectmen by advice of the overseer, and it goes on to say that they've hired a doctor to go out to the glass house and see what they could do for these people. Later on, it does tell us that all of them perished from the smallpox later in 1792 in December. Now, if we stopped there, it's an interesting story, but we don't really know that much else. And I should mention the glass house, there was the very first glass works in northern New England was built by a man from Boston in Temple in 1781. It was only operated for a few years and then it was abandoned. He brought all of his workers from the Boston area. And why he picked a mountainside in Temple, New Hampshire to build his glass house, nobody has really come up with a really good answer to that. But there was housing there. There was worker housing, and a group of Black people had settled in that housing after the glass house had ceased operations. But I chose Juba as my sort of example because don't underestimate what Google is going to give you. So then we Google Juba Savage, and the first thing that we come up with is this entry in Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors. For those of you who aren't familiar, this is a huge multi-volume compilation of the service records of the Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors of the Revolution. And Juba Savage is a patriot. Which is really exciting. But one of the great things that this gives us is that it locates his residence as Lincoln, Massachusetts. So now we have a town in Massachusetts where we can start chasing Juba's story down. So then we find this marriage intention from 1771 in the vital records of Weston, Massachusetts. And it says Juba, a Negro servant of Mr. Samuel Philip Savage of Weston, and Judith, a Negro servant of Captain Adams of Lincoln. Their intention of marriage has been published. And then we find him again in the treasurer's account books for Lincoln in the 1780s. And it turns out that Juba Savage had actually gained his freedom during his service in the Revolution. He and his wife Judith had purchased property in Lincoln. And by the 1780s, the town of Lincoln is actually paying Juba for the boarding of a woman named Lucy Oliver. This was a very typical way for towns to care for the poor and the indigent. Which was by basically farming them out to households and paying the households to care for the person. This is in the days before things like nursing homes, and this is how they took care of things. After that, he disappears from the records. But then another entry on Google takes us to Walden Pond. Juba Savage's property was located on Walden Pond, right where you can see here, that dotted red line is the town line between Concord and Lincoln. Henry David Thoreau talks about the Black community that grew up around Walden Pond in the late 18th century in his famous Walden. We found this because there was a research paper that had been done about that Black community in Concord in the 1990s, and they mentioned Juba Savage as being one of the people that they found in the deeds. But the real question to me is, okay, we lose sight of him from the official records in the 1780s. In 1790, we know he's in Temple, New Hampshire, and then he passes away in 1792. So what happens? How does he end up there? We don't have really any idea. Did he know someone who had worked at the glass houses so he knew there was housing available in Temple? That's a possibility. But I think an even stronger possibility is that there was another Black patriot that had lived in Temple named Aaron Oliver. Aaron actually died after he returned from the revolution from his wounds. He had been taken a prisoner of war, and his health was broken. But I do wonder, we have not found the thing that connects them, but I do wonder if Aaron Oliver and Lucy Oliver were related, and that Lucy Oliver is that third person in Juba Savage's household in 1790. So more digging to be done there. Now, I want to turn over to Jennifer. She's going to discuss how to get the most out of the resources, how to manage the research, and then how we're starting to share the stories of the people that we've uncovered. So take it away, Jennifer.
All right, thank you. I'm seeing all these little chats pop up, and people have some information that's going to be really helpful to us. So I'm getting excited. So one of the things we thought it would be important to share is these tips and tricks to as we've gone through this process with our volunteers. And I want to talk a little bit about census. We started with census because it's really not difficult to access census records. They're available for free on FamilySearch.org. And a lot of our volunteers actually had subscriptions to Ancestry.com. Again, this was during COVID when we started. So a lot of historical societies and libraries had closed. But nowadays, if we were to start a project like that, knowing that a lot of libraries and museums, historical societies also have access to Ancestry.com if that's the way to go. So you can always check with your local library. So to become acquainted with the census was the most important thing as we started. So we did, as Michelle mentioned, we did an online training, and we decided, or Michelle had decided as a part of this, is that why don't we start with the 1850 census? So it became important for us to understand that the census, having started in 1790, and the reasons for it have evolved over time as to why the government is conducting these census, what information is needed. So how does the census change over time? The earliest form of census are not on pre-printed forms. You can see an example of one here from 1820, Dinah Freeman of Peterborough, New Hampshire. And so if you didn't, those are very difficult to read. So what's listed is the head of household. And we wanted to acquaint our citizen archivists with census records by starting with the year 1850, because individuals were all listed within a household. So you can get a better sense of who everybody was in a family. And so we moved forward in time up to 1930, and then our citizen archivists backtracked. And so it would start to go from 1840 back to 1790. And that worked really well because everyone became acquainted with the process. And then we can meet periodically over Zoom. And if anyone was having difficulty reading anything or understanding something, we could all look at it together, which was very nice. But one of the things with not having pre-printed forms, as in the later census years, the earlier ones can be really difficult because the headings of those census columns are not listed on every page. So if you were to go to the National Archives, you could, or even Google, 1820 federal census headings, you can have a copy of that. So that's something we made available to our volunteers so that they could continue to do this research, so that we would then know, for instance, with this one with Dinah Freeman, the age ranges that we're working with this free family of color that was in Peterborough in 1820. So the other thing that was really important to instill in our volunteers is that we did not want volunteers relying on transcriptions. We really wanted volunteers to look at the original records. And as an example, I wanted to bring up one here. Brigadier General James Reed was born in Woburn, Mass. in the 1720s. And then he moved to Southwest New Hampshire to Fitzwilliam, where he worked as an innkeeper and a tailor. He became a captain in the French and Indian Wars and a brigadier general in the American Revolution. So returning to New Hampshire after the war, he settled in Keene, where he's located in this first federal census, which took place. And the transcription that you see here indicates that there were 3 free white males in the household and 2 free white females. But the actual record actually depicts a different story. So if you were to look at, if you could try to look at this original record, they have to say this was the only census year that was blurry. So you tried to make it as clear as possible. But what you'll notice is that the person who transcribed that census missed the free person of color who was also living in that household. So that last column would have indicated that there's a free person of color. So that's just an example as to why it's so important to be looking at original records, because sometimes things are written off to the side or across the page, or there might be a name crossed out for a reason, and we needed all of that information as clues to move further. The other issue we had in particular with this census, going back a sec, Michelle, for us in Cheshire County, and I'm not sure if this is a problem anywhere else in the world, is that the 1790 census, aside from having been blurry, we didn't realize, if you're a genealogist, quite often we're looking for first name, last name of a person. But when we're not doing that, when we're looking by entire town, we assigned all of our volunteers to look at the 1790 census original documents and record in that Google form every person of color or family of color. And what we found is that they grouped all the towns together for Cheshire County in this year, and that's how it's accessible on Ancestry. So unfortunately, we had many volunteer citizen archivists all entering in many, many names, and they were all recording the same names. This isn't something we'd ever come across before. So it was daunting work for our poor volunteers. And in the end, we had to delete a lot of it because we realized it was duplication of work. So we ended up being able to find a copy of a census where we could denote which town everybody was from. But, I don't know if that'll happen anywhere else, but it certainly happened to us. Something else to look for is beware of bleed through. So this happened. This is one of the reasons why, as Michelle mentioned, she and I are the ones that have access to the main authority file, and we try to spend our time going through and editing the work that's been done by our citizen archivists. One of the things that trips people up quite easily, as you could see, is some census records, the forms were actually double-sided. So as the census taker flipped to the other side, sometimes there's bleed through from the ink. And so as you're looking at this, I mean, if you were to look at this record for New Hampshire, one might think that there were quite a few people of color living in New Hampshire at the time. But what's actually happening is that it's the bleed through from the other side. And one way of being able to figure that out is the slant is different in this record than what we'd normally see, but also looking at the totals, the aggregate numbers, to verify what we think we're finding. So that's something that we had to go back through and look at quite closely in some of those years. The other thing I wanted to mention is that pre-Civil War, we're looking for, as you can see on this, for enslaved folk and Black folk living in Southwest New Hampshire. We found that in some years, though, the columns were removed for the free persons of color. And so that last column was chopped off. And so, and that part of that has to do with the fact that there wasn't supposed to be slavery in New Hampshire at the time. But what we found then is that free people of color were actually then put into that last remaining column, which is marked as enslaved, but it just created another level or layer of complication for us in realizing that we are actually recording free people of color, but they're just in that column. So all the additional research is so necessary to verify the information that we're finding. So we found that with this process, we can't really always assume that a person is listed as enslaved. We can't always assume then that a free person of color living within a white household at the turn of the 18th century may have actually been legally free, but may not have been paid for their labor or may not have had an opportunity to move elsewhere. And so, as we move through these records, we're also really wondering or interested in what's the full story of some of these individuals and families. And we're really hoping that through this process, we're going to learn a bit more. So know that census takers into the 20th century were responsible for identifying a person's race or the race of the family members. So people really didn't have an opportunity to self-identify until the 1960 census, and mm, people it wasn't on the census to identify as more than one race until the 2000 census. So as you look at the history of census, it's really interesting for the story that it has to say about the way in which Americans have defined race over time. Now, there was one man that we have in our project living in Alstead, New Hampshire. He's defined as mulatto in the 1920 census, but he's identified as white in the 1900, 1910, 1930, 1940, and 1950 census. So perhaps then the census taker may have made a mistake. Nobody in his family going back generations is identified as anything but white. So we often have people that we're researching that we're really just not sure based on the research if it's somebody that belongs in this project or not, which is a really interesting predicament to be in, I would say. But as we're collecting all this data, we're trying to make decisions. And to add to the complication, there are other records like this one. This is a World War II draft registration card from 1952 for the same person. And here he's identifying as Oriental. In another record, he self-identifies as Mongolian. And so we have to wonder what the story is behind this person and this family. And did we add this name? Do we add this name into our project even though it may be a mistake? Or do we admit a name and say that they don't belong in the project? And I think this is one of the things that we feel really self-conscious about. And we talk to our volunteers about that. It's an uncomfortable sort of position that we're putting ourselves in as mainly Caucasian individuals trying to make decisions about individuals in this project. But we've also determined through research on this individual that his parents split up shortly after his birth, which adds to this possibility. Was his father really his father? And so we may never know the answers to some of these questions, but it does bring up some points in the next slide that we have to consider the fact that not everybody celebrated birthdays as a widespread cultural phenomenon in our country into the 20th century, and that comes with the rise of consumerism and the decline in infant mortality. And so more parents are putting time and effort into these birthdays through the years. But that means that there are a lot of people that just didn't know when they were born or how old they were specifically. Amos Freeman was living in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, and may not have known his birthday. He's one where the dates seem to fluctuate. And some of the records indicate 1764, some say 1768. He may have been born in any number of towns in Cheshire County. Swansea, Fitzwilliam, and Winchester have Amos Freeman listed. And as an adult, it does appear as a head of household in census records and as a resident of Fitzwilliam. But what this calls to mind is that there are sometimes cultural taboos and things aren't disclosed to your government, your local government census taker. So when you think about race, maybe divorce, adoptions, having a child out of wedlock, or children being born to a parent who is cheating on a spouse or things like that, we know that there's going to be mistakes because families aren't always going to disclose all of the things that are happening within their household. And so as a child, we weren't sure where Amos Freeman lived. We didn't know who his father was. So the head of household who would have been listed on the census record. But there was an Amos Freeman born to a Benjamin Freeman in Winchester, New Hampshire in the 1760s. And when Benjamin Freeman died, he was a resident of Swansea in 1807. His will indicated that each of his children were to receive a portion of his estate. And so at some point, the judge of probate, Abel Parker, put out a notice in the local paper. And this notice was basically verifying that, yes, Amos Freeman is the child of Benjamin Freeman. And this seems to have been presenting maybe some complications for his half siblings at the time of his father's death, but he did receive a portion of the estate. So with our census complete, volunteers went through everything. We moved on to our next phase, which was looking through town and county histories. And one of the things we did, Michelle had said, well, I use archive.org. I said, that's great. Let's have our volunteers do that. And so if you were to search for history of town of Antrim, New Hampshire on the archive.org site, you would end up with a whole bunch of stuff. And it's really difficult to find that town history that you're actually looking for. So then this tip came from Michelle. We figured out that if you actually just Google, say, history of the town of Antrim, New Hampshire, archive.org into the Google search field, it pops up. Google does the work and finds the publication that you're actually looking for. So a lot of those town histories, if there was one written for your town, are available and accessible for free. So this was a next step for us. And so once our volunteers got to the right publication, they would go inside and use the search inside field in order to look up the name of the individuals that we had at this point a good list from the census of people who lived in the community. So we were looking for those names. We were looking for the white heads of households to learn more about them and their lives if we had unidentified people of color living within a household, and finding passages related to keywords. And so that's one thing that we have that we'll make sure is included. But we did a lot of thinking around this, and we spoke with other organizations that have done work on this as well, that there's certain keywords we're going to need to be looking at, especially thinking about the fact that a lot of these town histories are written at the turn of the 20th century. And so what are the terms or words that would have been used at that time? So a word like slave, servant, Negro, we had a list. And so that's something that we'll share because it's really important as we go through this process. So as a story, I want to mention that John and Abigail Stewart, for instance, are from Antrim, New Hampshire, and they were not in the census records when searching for people of color. And they did, however, appear in the town's history as people of color. So Abigail was recorded in the town history as having had a, quote, tinge of the African, and her husband, John, was identified as Indian. She's also known in the town history as Granny Stewart and was a self-taught doctress. So granny was a term for women who were healers and midwives in the 18th to 19th century. And while these town histories often stereotype or minimize the role of people of color in the community, they are a resource that we can use to lead us to other primary sources. So Abigail's maiden name was Phipps, and she came to New Hampshire from Ipswich, Massachusetts. And there's interesting stories that have surrounded her life where indicating that she's actually the great-granddaughter of Sir William Phipps, a white man. Sir William Phipps was the first royal governor of Massachusetts. He was the court of oyer and terminer of the Salem witch trials. And Michelle was telling me recently that he basically lit the fire on those Salem witch trials until his wife was accused, and he shut it all down. So Phipps is known. He didn't have any children of his own, though, but we do know that he had both enslaved Indigenous and Black people in his household. And so volunteers are now trying to link Abigail Stewart of Antrim to Sir William Phipps. And so this is work that's being done thanks to the fact that the town history provided some information about this couple who is living in town. So another way to use archive.org, I'll add, is to be able to access scholarly works that might not be available or accessible through interlibrary loan. So here's some other quick tips for you. So we did census, we did town history, and we had a really good list of individuals by town at this point. And so we would create these lists that we would then feed back to our citizen archivists to say, here's all of the individuals you've recovered at this point. Let's go more in depth. And the next step for that for us was to use vital records. So we wanted to try to find everyone's birth, marriage, death record, or cemetery records. And so once you begin finding this information, it's wonderful because you're then also finding more information about other family members. So you might find out who their parents were, or a spouse, or their children's names, or their birthplace, which could lead you into other areas. And so as we're doing this work with our list, we realized then that we now had to circle back to census records and town histories again. So there's this never-ending cycle of going back to these original sources because you're finding more information about these individuals and their lives and their families. And something else we then needed to consider for the project is, how are we going to use vital records on, say, ancestry.com to maybe try to identify people who weren't on our list? How can we find new names? And so one of the ways that we did that was to, when you're in Ancestry, for instance, and you go to search a record, rather than entering a first name and last name, what you can do is enter the town you're looking for. And we checked off, yes, exactly this town, because our citizen archivists were working on specific towns. And then you can go under race and nationality, and using those search terms that we mentioned before that we'll share with you, entering those in one at a time and seeing what hits you can get from that. And we found many people who weren't included on our list. One is listed here, Sylvia Banskett. She died in Keene, New Hampshire in 1854. And this is the only record we have of her at this point. We don't know more about her, but whoever was helping fill out this death record for her when she died knew enough to say that she was 44 years old, and that under cause of death, it says a slave. So whoever was filling this out knew that she was either enslaved or she formerly, in some point in her life, was most likely enslaved. And so this is a really important document, and we'd like to find more on her. The other thing we did, not only searching by race and town, is to search by town and surname. So for instance, we have an 1820 census listing for a free family of color in Fitzwilliam. So we know that in 1820, John Moody is living as the head of household with his family in Fitzwilliam. And also then in the household was one male under 14, two females under 14 years, and two females between the ages of 26 and 45. So we don't know who these family members are. So I thought, what if we could do a search where we are entering in the town, Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, and then under the surname, the last name, just the term, just Moody. And so in doing that, that's what we did for this search, is to look at Moody and anyone that lived or was born, lived in any vital records related to Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire. So in doing that, we did find some interesting things. We found the children. We've now identified who they are. So Silas Moody, we found a death record. He was born in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, and he died in Worcester, Mass. in 1898. So in his death record listed here, it does indicate Fitzwilliam, but also that his parents were James Moody and Lydia Humphrey. So now we know who his mother is. We know who John Moody's wife is. It does say James Moody here, but we've reached a point where we're like, keep it in the mix, even if something's a little bit off, like saying James, considering the fact that we also had this inclination or idea that maybe the father, John Moody, had died shortly after the 1820 census because the family doesn't appear in any other census after 1820. So if John Moody had died young, if this Silas Moody's father died young, he might not have remembered his name, or the person who helped fill this out might not have known John versus James. So next. The daughter, Lydia, this was interesting as well. So as I mentioned, at this point we have citizen archivists assigned to towns. We also have a series of volunteers who are assigned to types of sources. People we know are really good at reading probate records. That's important, or church records. Those can be really difficult to read. So we want to make sure we have seasoned volunteers for those. So daughter Lydia Moody was one of the children as well listed in that 1820 census. So we found her death record, and we noticed that she died in 1904 in Worcester. And it indicates here that she was born in Keene, New Hampshire, which is right next to Fitzwilliam. It's near Fitzwilliam. So doing further research, we discovered that as a child, she was baptized into the Congregational Church in Keene. And there's a note underneath that indicates that the minister of the church in Keene, Reverend Zedekiah Barstow, took her into his home to care for her. And she was listed as the child of the late John Moody. So we know then that one of the ministers took in one of the children. So in her 1904 death, she's remembered for having grown up in Keene, although she was born in Fitzwilliam. And so in doing that, we started looking through Fitzwilliam's church records, and we found that the minister in Fitzwilliam took in the other daughter. So two of the girls were taken in by ministers in the region. Next. And then the last thing we found was another record, Sylvester Moody. He's another child of the family in Norwich, Connecticut. He is getting married in 1874. So Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire is listed as his birthplace. And this then indicates that at the time of that 1820 census, most likely his mother was pregnant with him. So the family was about to grow. And so in doing all of this research and looking back then from one Keene church record to the Fitzwilliam church records, we found that John Moody had in fact died shortly after that 1820 census. And the children were pretty much placed in other homes around the region and cared for by community members. So, moving on, one other thing I want to mention that's an interesting find, but a difficult resource in some ways, is that we are combing through a lot of primary sources and spending more time on this summer. We're going to be spending more time on probate records, specifically for some of the families. And did we miss am I on the wrong slide? The Freeman Ferry? We'll come back to it. It'll pop up again. That's fine. So we could go back. One of the things we realized is that with all of these sources is that you can go into familysearch.org, and there are sources in there that are digitized but are just not searchable yet. And so one of the things you can do is a search by place. And so and then when you do that, you can look for, say, New Hampshire. In those search results, there would be a list, and there's only 28 collections listed here. But one of those was New Hampshire Town Clerk and Town Vital Town Records. So this was uploaded in 2020, so it's a bit newer on Family Search, and it's one of those sources that is digitized, but it wouldn't appear if you were to do a search for a name and the name wouldn't appear on the main page. So moving on to the next slide. When you go into this source, what you'll see is you have the option of either entering in somebody's name. And for us, because we're researching an entire community, we just wanted to see what there was for Cheshire County. So browse all images is what we selected. And when you do that, next slide, you get a listing of the counties in New Hampshire where early town records and vital records were digitized. And so in selecting Cheshire County, then we saw the towns, a lot of the towns in Cheshire County had digital records like this. And what we were looking for are early town records. So in the case of Hinsdale, we have town records going back to 1753, which is fantastic because we could then look for look for individuals from our list in those early selectmen records, but it's reading page by page. So it's kind of painstaking work, and bookmark it or figure out where you left off, because if you leave this and come back to it a few weeks later, you're not going to remember where you left off with this. But for Sullivan, New Hampshire, we knew that there was a Peter Barker who lived in the area. And so, oh yeah, now I'm back to my page here. He was a person of color residing in Sullivan at the turn of the 19th century. So he had been a private in the American Revolution and served in New Hampshire's 3rd Regiment. And following the war, then he moves into Sullivan, New Hampshire. And the town records really tell us a little bit more and prove that he was pretty active in the community. So in 1797, he appears in Sullivan. And I think this is what's great. The first thing that's really great about these selectmen records is that you can go through them, looks for tax records, for instance, and you can start to trace somebody's residency within that community, which is super helpful. And sometimes it's giving you more information, like an occupation of a person, who their neighbors were, who other family members are, and that kind of thing. So we know that he was paying taxes, that he owned land. We have a 1797 record we found and an 1808. So that gives us some parameters around the time in which he was in the area. And then we can use that information to go back and look at, say, vital records again, or other things we might have missed. What we found is that he married Elithina Dorchester in 1805. She was a young woman of color whose family was also living in Sullivan at the time. And through the town history book, then, that we learned that Peter Barker did die in 1810, having eaten chestnuts. So when you start to see how you could exhaust many types of historical records, it provides us with more complete picture of a person's life. So for us, we know this is an ongoing project. For us, this isn't a race to see how many names we can gather. It's really about looking at this as an opportunity to really look in depth at the daily lives of people of color in rural New England, rural New Hampshire, and then rural New England. Yeah, okay, here's Ferry. Thank you. So, as I said, probate records are what we'll be looking at this summer, and probate records are very interesting because they are a way in which it was to settle somebody's estate. And remembering then that this was a kind of a bartering society in the 18th century into the 19th century. And so a lot of times what they would do is do an inventory just to assess what somebody owned, and then you can settle accounts with people that you might have bartered services or goods for. And so we have a handful of individuals who have had probate records, and this is an example of one. And it's really fascinating because it gives you more information into a person's life. So looking at Freeman Ferry of Marlborough, New Hampshire, all we knew is that he died in 1837. And through this, his probate, we found letters from his employer saying that he was a painter. We found in his inventory that he did in fact own paint and paint supplies. We learned that he had taken ill and was being cared for by a community member for about 6 months before he died. So the inventory was being used to pay that person for the care he had given. But we also get to see into his daily life. So he was literate, he was well read, he owned a lot of publications, and we believe he was also a musician. So he owned a fiddle and a flute. So it's really interesting to see this. So moving just quickly because I'm about done here. So as we mentioned, we've gathered about 2,600 entries from volunteers. And I've spent the last year really going through all of that. And what we realized is we needed another system of just organizing this project because it's getting so large. So at this point, and everything's in spreadsheets, I love spreadsheets, but we have a summary, we call a summary source, that we can list every known individual by town, and then we could check off which sources we've gone through. And this is to help us so that if a new volunteer comes in, we know what to assign them for each individual person in each individual town. Next. And then you'll notice we have, this is an example of some of those records that we're working our way through for each individual person. And that some of these have hyperlinks. So what the hyperlinks lead to is a Google form. So the Google form, we have a Google form for each person, or we're working our way towards that. And what that does is 4 things. It's where we can sort all of the entries about a person from our main spreadsheet into a timeline order. And I have an example of that here. So this George Henry Ashe, we can enter everything we've learned about him in timeline order. And then we put footnotes with links to the original documents so that I can easily access any original document primary source I need to about this person. So another thing it does then is once we get it all together, we need to do some sort of genealogy. It gets very confusing, who's who in a family. So we work through the players and which one of those lived in Southwest New Hampshire. And then we use that to create bios. And so in this instance, we have Mr. Ashe from Chesterfield, and we have his bio. And so this will go onto a website that we are about to launch in June. And I wanted to just show that. It's our BIPOC Monadnock site. We're entering bios on individuals right now. This site will be sorted. You could sort by topic, you can sort by town in Southwest New Hampshire, or by surname. So we're anxiously awaiting this website going live, but we're also frantically adding as much information as we can to this because we have so much information. So it'll be an ongoing project for years to come. So our hope then is that all of this information is accessible to anybody, that we can use. Students and teachers are using this. We're creating curriculum around it, that scholars and researchers are using it for new publications or programming, and the general public is able to access it. And we hope to be able to connect with descendants of some of these families to really learn more and continue this work, so that we're finding connections and we're learning more about the African American experience in New England. So we're interested in other projects going on as well, because I have a feeling we're starting to see these links between communities and throughout New England, and we're really anxious to pull all that together. So I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Jennifer. That was just fantastic. And what is so striking to me is you've just uncovered all these lives, and then partially because of your knowledge of the period and the region, you're able to bring these statistics to life, and we get a sense of people behind the census figures and so forth, which is really exciting. It's fantastic. You must let us know when the website goes live, and we will make sure everybody finds out about it on our email list. So we've had quite a few questions. Couple of questions have to do, I'm going to back off for a moment and then come back to the specific ones. You've got so much data. What are the general trends that you see from all these lives that you've traced? Or is there anything that stands out?
Michelle, I can answer. I mean, one of the things that is not surprising, but it's still striking, it's in being rural Southwest New Hampshire, is that there's a lot of individuals moving in to a community for any number of reasons, but it's they might be the only person in the entire community, and so we
Mm.
always have these questions that are like, how does a 15-year-old girl from Kentucky end up in Surrey, New Hampshire? What are the connections that are happening there? And it seems like there was some solitude in some ways, and so we're really curious to know about the connections between individuals, not just not just within a community or a household, but really within the region. And we're starting to see that more and more with more research we've done, is that we're starting to trace these relationships and connections between Southwest New Hampshire and then areas of Vermont and Massachusetts, especially. And that's the exciting part is, yes, there are connections and there are reasons why people are moving around, but people are moving around a lot. That's the other thing we've noticed with this project. And I know Michelle wants to add to that.
Yeah, I guess I would say that there are a lot more people living here in like the pre-revolutionary to 1820 period than I would have suspected before we did the research. And then we see kind of a trough of where there's the population of Black people in the area goes down. And then at the end of the 19th century, it starts to go back up. And a lot of those people are coming from the South. They're born in Virginia or North Carolina, which is not surprising, but that earlier history it was surprising to me. I think that the number of enslaved people has probably been traditionally kind of undercounted, and we're still working on those numbers.
Mhm.
So yeah.
I can't wait to see the website and all the stories coming through. There's a couple of people have asked about the categories that people are placed in the census or in a minister's notes, for instance. How do you deal with these categories, and how are they influenced? To what degree are they categories of their time that we would not recognize today? And how do you sort out that question of, if people are mulatto or Black or what, all the different ways that people are described?
Mhm.
Well, we haven't been distinguishing. When you look at the records in New Hampshire, at least, the default is that the assumption is everyone's white unless they're otherwise noted, So we've been looking at those otherwise noted people.
Mhm.
And as Jennifer said in the talk, there are some that it's questionable. Like what are we really talking about a person of color here or not? Should they be included or should they not? We've seen a number of marriages between a person of color and someone who's identified as white. But we haven't been calling those children of those marriages mulatto. Those kind of distinctions around race and color, we're just recording what we're finding. I'm not sure if I'm answering what Jennifer.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing. Yeah, we're just asking our volunteers just record what's there,
Mhm. Mhm.
but in looking at the history of the census and how race is defined is interesting because there wasn't always categories for things. So we might find somebody who's like born in Turkey or Syria who's listed as a person of, like
Right.
as Black, because there wasn't there weren't these categories for that
Mhm.
as much as we have now on our census, and it's still an issue that people discuss, right? So, yeah, I think it's been an interesting thing. Michelle brought up another good point. We're finding a lot of intermarriages,
Mhm.
which is surprised us. That's another surprising thing in the project. And Indigenous history that we hadn't expected
Right.
as much as we are finding in our area, and especially looking at some of the Indigenous folks from Massachusetts coming up into the area, as opposed to what I thought we would find with the Abenaki in our region that we
Mhm.
always refer to. So
Right.
there's more story there. So this
Are
project
you
is
recording that separately? That I was going to ask about Indigenous people and what you're finding. Are you keeping track of that, or is that just a whole other project?
yeah, we are, and that's why we decided that we were going to call our website BIPOC Monadnock, because we are incorporating yeah, the more broadly defined people of color.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
There's a question of someone saying, how do you deal with records that say unnamed? So you know that there was a slave owner, but the the individuals involved are anonymous. How do you deal with that?
We cry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We wish that they use names. Well, what we've been doing is recording those households and then researching those households. And well, I can give you an example. In Peterborough, we knew that a man named Samuel Auld had um, 2 enslaved people in his household. And then we find this woman, Dinah Freeman, in 1820, living as a free person of color, heading her own household. And then months later, we find a land record that references where she lived and refers to it as Dinah Auld's house.
Mm.
So she's not called Dinah Freeman, she's called Dinah Auld. So that leads us to believe that she's one of the people who had been enslaved by Samuel Auld
Mhm.
previous to that time. So
Yeah.
there, it's really, you have to kind of go around, it to try to identify people.
Mhm.
And there probably will be many unidentified people that we're not going to be able to recover their names. But in some cases, I think we will be able to recover their names. And
Yeah.
that's
But
really exciting. That's
Yeah.
really exciting to me, to give someone's name back to them.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think so. That yeah, too. That one of the reasons why we're focusing on probate records this summer, when we have an internal work on that too with us, is um, that it's looking through these probates of white heads of household, but not just that, their extended family, because there that might be a clue or a way of understanding how people came into a household, and maybe being named through probate. And so church records, probate, like we've found mention of people in deeds, um, even what do you call them, plans or lots, like drawings of lots that were given, and that kind of thing. So there's it's going to be a lot of needle in the haystack kind of
Yeah.
process of looking for information.
There are 2 questions about sources. One is the usefulness of Find a Grave, and the other is whether you've looked at family histories of, say, early settlers, and they write their own family history that might mention people.
Well, I'd like to take the part about Find a Grave. I think with any, just like Jennifer was saying, don't trust the transcriptions on Family Search or Ancestry. You really have to look at the original record. The same thing goes with Find a Grave. Anything that you get from Find a Grave, you really have to take with sort of a grain of salt. I've even seen them where there's a picture of the grave and what's written about it has a different date than what's on the stone, So, but it is really handy to not have to drive to some obscure little cemetery on a back road and you can see a picture of the stone and read what the stone says. But we've also found that there's sometimes people will put little bios in there and they might reference a source that we're totally unaware of. So then we can go to that source. So it is worth doing, but like
And
any of these things, you really want to double check and link
right.
it back to its ultimate original source.
Mhm.
I think another thing with Find a Grave, like one thing that was helpful for me, there was somebody listed in a town history, and I can't remember the town right now, but the name was spelled wrong. So it was a reminiscence of a time long ago when so and so lived in town. And in just trying combinations of names in the cemetery, just doing a search for the cemetery in the town, I found this person. So you might find who they're buried next to or family members. And so I think it's good for that. It's a good tip, like a town history is, but it's not the only source. We have to verify our sources.
Mhm, mhm. And the other question was about family histories from
Oh,
early,
right.
early,
Um,
early, colonists.
yeah, those family histories contain so much information and have oftentimes a richness that you don't find like in a town. All the town histories have those genealogy sections, but sometimes they can be pretty dry. The family histories tend to tell more stories about people's households and who lived there. So they're definitely worth checking. Um, that is among the many layers to go
Right.
down with
Yeah, we haven't gotten there.
each individual and family. Yeah.
Another question is, are you seeing connections with any of these individuals that you've unearthed and the Underground Railroad?
Connections between individuals. It's been interesting because 4 years in, we've reached a point. I have my team of I don't remember what you called them, Michelle, but the volunteers that are really into this and won't let go. Um,
The
that
super
we're
researchers.
super researchers that it's very interesting that we're seeing connections not just maybe within the same generation, but even multi-generation. So like, oh my god, a great granddaughter of this family married the grandniece of nephew of this person. And so these connections are much wider geographically, but also through time.
Mhm.
um we're starting to see those connections being made, which is super super exciting.
That is. But also, I think the question also was about, is there any trace of
Underground.
the Underground Railway going through southern?
Yeah. From my perspective, I've been a museum administrator for over 25 years, and um I've worked in 13 museums. And it's a common thing for people to come in and say that they want to, I think my house was on the Underground Railroad, and a focus on the house. And it's I got started on this project because of a Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire workshop on the Underground Railroad. Um, and the guest speaker was talking about how we focus so much on the dwellings of a house, the secret, you know, room behind the fireplace or trapdoor or something. That what we really need to be doing is focusing on the individuals of color who lived within a household and understanding your community in that way, because the Underground Railroad is really about the connections and networking. And so that's what prompted me to start this project for Cheshire County and connect with Michelle. And I'm hoping that at some point we'll really be able to try to verify some of that information. There are a lot of stories, and they
Mhm.
tend to get passed down over time in town histories and then in newspapers. But how do you prove, like, that's the difficult part. There aren't a lot of primary sources, and we get people in asking for our Underground Railroad collection, and we don't have one because we don't have one.
Right. I
Mhm.
would just say that two things about that. The Underground Railroad activity in the Monadnock region is really it's understudied. It's not something that we necessarily know a lot about. We have a lot of fragmentary stuff. We have some recently recovered abolitionist society records, things like that, but nobody has really done a systematic study of that. So we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. With the project, we told the volunteers this when we were getting people trained. If we ran into stuff about that, we wanted to catch it and write it down, but that was not our primary mission here,
Mhm.
because it's very easy to slide into telling the story of white abolitionists, and
Right.
that's not what our focus is. Our focus is to uncover the lives and the life stories of people of color who lived here over the last 200 years
Mhm.
or over that 200-year time frame.
Well, that is a really good note. We have to end, although I would just say quite a few people have written in to say they've done research
Mm.
in different places, that and endless amounts of people being really happy and saying this is excellent, and you know, just lots, your charts are great, you know, just really, people are really happy. I have a feeling your presentation is going to be, we're recording it, it's going to be watched over and over. It's really invaluable information. Do you want to just say something quickly about whether people should contact you, Jennifer, in particular? You were willing to kind of be a hub
Yeah.
for.
Well, somebody had reached out already, and I'm happy to speak with them. And I think Michelle and I are both very anxious to be able to talk to people who might be connected through this project in any way, or just to know who's doing what where, because like we said, there's connections all over New England, and we want to be able to continue our research. It'd be great if you know, it's a shared experience.
Yeah.
So I think we're both happy to be accessible.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. It's just fantastic. I have a few housekeeping things to go through before we close. An email for Jennifer. I'm just going to put it in here. And I'll send around all the contacts sorry, I'm trying to talk and type at the same time, and I'll do it in just a minute. I'm going to send around all the contacts as well as the link to the recording once it's done, and some of the links that people have put in the chat. So I want to thank everybody for attending. I really want to thank Jennifer and Michelle for just superb. I want to make a final pitch, two final pitches. One is we have a really wonderful presentation coming up. Emily Gavalt, who is a curator at the American Folk Art Museum, and curated an exhibition called Unnamed Figures about New England art, well, early American art and the presence, or I would say lack thereof, of Black people in early American art. And she'll be giving a presentation for us on the 15th of May, specifically about New England, early New England art, starting in the 17th century, and how it portrays or fails to do so with the Black residents of New England. So please join us for that, May 15th at 6 p.m., not 7. And also, on a less felicitous note, we are determined, we are committed to providing free programming for everyone, to as many people as possible. But like as everyone else is finding, our costs are going up and up and up and up and up. There's particularly all these online platforms that we need, Eventbrite, Zoom, SurveyMonkey, Constant Contact, you name it, they are charging, and their charges are rising. And so at the very baseline, basic running cost for each event is costing us over $400. And then we have honoraria on top of it, which is, they're paltry, but they're something. So if you can give, we would be so grateful. We really need the support, and we are falling behind on our budget. And this will help us to reach more people and do more events like this. So thank you, everybody. And I'm going to write in Jennifer's email now, and hsccnh.org. And we hope to see you on the 15th.